Yes, just to say that we are very pleased to be back, and that we were a little bit worried that, well, we obviously hope that the international section is very successful, but at the same time we wouldn't like too many people to be here that we didn't have an opportunity to speak. So we're very pleased to be here again. So in Bielefeld, which I do know exists because I actually live in Germany. I live in Frankfurt, so I actually do know about Bielefeld. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the crime prevention maturity model. And this focuses on the way in which you can embed security within urban design and planning. So it doesn't cover all of crime prevention. It is very much about the urban design and planning aspects. And this actually came out of a project that we were working on, which was called PLUS, Planning Urban Security, which was led by the Landeskriminalamt in Niedersachsen, who are here today. And the aim of PLUS was to look at the ways of integrating crime prevention within urban planning activities. Now, obviously, as you'll be aware, there's been a lot of previous approaches to that, and a lot of that is about design principles. Much of it based on crime prevention through environmental design, so much of it based on SEPTED, often illustrated with examples of good practice. What we've also got is a lot of guidance for addressing crime prevention, and some of that does actually look at how you can integrate crime prevention within planning processes and procedures. But the difficulty you have is that that tends to be very specific to a national context. So, for instance, in the UK, the document that we've got is Safer Places, but that fits with the UK context, and it isn't something that you can easily transfer to another country. So what we decided to do in terms of the maturity model was to look at ways of addressing not just crime, but also other related social issues within the planning process. And this actually builds on some work that we did previously, which was about the Design Against Crime exchange tool, which was looking at different contexts across Europe, which are very different, not just only in the types of crime issues that there are, but also in terms of attitudes to design, attitudes to planning, attitudes to urban development. And what we wanted then was that a model that was actually transferable to different EU contexts.
Okay, so thinking about maturity model, I'm not sure how many people here will have heard of the term before, but in terms of what a capability maturity model is, it's something that was developed by Carnegie Mellon University in the US, and it was around large defense projects that the US government was funding, and it was a way of trying to look at how you could better ensure effectiveness of spending of the money on projects. So it's a sort of a project management, project improvement approach. And it's been developed into a number of different areas, a number of different industries. This is an example of one I found on Wikipedia, which was to do with software engineering. But it's a stepped approach to improving processes for delivery and capability of delivering projects. So it's maturity in terms of formality, be that documentation or the ability to repeat things, in terms of processes that are used and how they're evaluated and managed, and also maturity in terms of the expertise that's required and therefore the training and the development that's required in order to deliver it at the different levels. So when we were looking at developing the model around crime prevention, the first thing we started with was the crime problem. Most gateway into thinking about crime prevention is through a specific problem. And so what normally happens is that there's a crime problem and a one-off project is done to actually try and address that specific problem. So it's addressing an existing problem that exists, and you're trying to have an intervention to get rid of this. Again, this is built environment development stuff, so it may be developing a youth shelter or something that addresses a particular problem in a particular community. So we took that as being the initial level in terms of being the way into crime prevention that most people take. And that, we've actually said that that's crime reduction rather than prevention, in that it's reducing a problem that already exists, and it's therefore reactive to a problem rather than being proactive. But there may be more than one project. If it goes well, another project may be done. So I don't know if you can see, but it actually repeats here. It's a bit faint here, but the idea is that you do it once and you may well do it again because it's successful. The next level, level 2, is where it becomes more strategic. So this is where, if it's been accepted as something that is worth doing, that you then look at how you might build a repeatable way of delivering crime prevention. So that may be involving the consideration of prevention within urban development plans or within key projects, so large building projects. And this is the beginning of what you'd call crime prevention, because this is trying to incorporate a preventative measure in something that doesn't exist yet, so in a development before it's actually being built. And this is proactive in its attempt to reduce crime. And then you have level 3, which is where it becomes even more formalised, and so it may be then what we've called managed, in that it may be incorporated within a planning control process. So you may well then start looking at incorporating a decision of whether or not a developer has thought about crime prevention within the approval process for whether they're allowed to build or not. And then finally we have level 4, which we've called embedded, which was where crime prevention becomes integrated within good practice of designers, planners, developers. It becomes part of the whole development process without necessarily having to be enforced externally. It's something that's seen as just good practice. Similarly, consideration of safety, fire, structural issues that perhaps 100 years ago weren't automatically part of good practice are now accepted as being part of the remit of a particular professional group. And so what we have here in this model is increasing professionalisation of the approach to crime prevention, and consequently you have a need for training and skills development as you move up this maturity model. And between each level, we have what we called a capability gap, which was what we were looking at when we were comparing the different cases across Europe, was what was the context, what were the circumstances, what were the skills and abilities that were enabling people to operate at these different levels. Okay, so thinking about the first level, level 1, which is our initial level, we're looking at one-off development processes. And we came up with a number of descriptors, so essential features and optional features. I'm not going to go into all of these because we haven't got time. There's actually copies of the report on the table over there, which was the PLUS model, came out of the PLUS project. But the key thing about the level at this stage is that security is addressed, but it's ad hoc. So it may happen on one project, one development, but it may not happen on another one. And that the skills and knowledge that are brought together may be disbanded afterwards. People may move off. They may come together, maybe an excellent project, but they may move off again and not work on crime prevention again. And this may be different groups of either developers, but also including people like the police or social agencies that might be involved in crime prevention. But there is, however, the opportunity to learn and to repeat this sort of approach at this level.
And to give you an example of level 1, on our project, the PLUS project, we were working with Szczecin in Poland, and they had particular problems in residential areas. The residential areas weren't used by residents. There was a lack of sense of ownership, and the areas were very poorly maintained. As a result of that, there was also a lot of criminal activity and antisocial behaviour. But where they had particular concern was about violence against women, against children. And that had led to a lot of feelings of insecurity. And that was one of the main drivers for actually addressing the problems there. And so we worked with the police in Szczecin, but the police were actually working together with partners on a specific project to address the problems of crime and insecurity. And as a result of their activities, then the courtyards were renovated. And they also managed to develop mechanisms where the residents themselves came to maintain the courtyard areas. So they went from looking like that to now looking like this. They were supported in their activities by a national strategy of development for Poland. But I'm not saying that that drove the project, but it did support the project being delivered. They are looking to move to level 2 in the sense that they want to be able to repeat some of the success of this project. And so they're looking, for instance, to include CEPTEB principles within new developments.
Okay, so thinking about level 2, which again is the repeatable level, we looked at the descriptors for this level and came up with essential and optional features. The main characteristics of this level are that the consideration of security is more formalized. So this requires senior in the authority or political agreement in order to do this. I think in the Poland example, the national strategy was a sort of a mechanism for allowing resources to be focused in that way. But also it requires, if different groups are working together, agreed protocols in terms of how they work and the way in which this is going to be delivered and who's responsible for what to be agreed. And this can form an opportunity for partnerships which may not previously exist, but could be used to take the whole process of crime prevention further and perhaps move themselves further up the maturity model as required.
The example that we've got here is then the Landeskriminalamt in Lower Saxony, working again with partners, and they are moving between levels 2 and 3. In terms of their strategic development, then they have a lot of partnerships that have been set up to address crime prevention within design and planning. And that very much involves the local authorities working together. They've developed formal criteria for actually assessing new developments, and they've also developed guidelines, and they've been giving training to planners and to police. What was probably the most important thing was actually setting up pilot projects and actually testing the ideas. They were evaluated, and they were also of high profile. And more recently, what they've done is that they've set up an audit scheme for secure living. So that is an accreditation scheme. So if they wanted to move more fully to level 3, they're in a situation at the moment where they consider crime prevention within the planning process, in the sense that developers and architects are made aware of the need to consider crime issues, and that's part of the quality of life agenda. But if they wanted to go more fully into level 3, then they would need some kind of checking mechanism to actually enforce that. But it isn't necessarily that organisations want to move up the levels or to take that approach, because it depends on the context. If it's working okay as it is, then there isn't a reason to change it, because often change means an investment in terms of more resources, and so it has to be worthwhile doing that. So it's not inevitable that people move from one level to another. It's meant to be just a framework for understanding the different approaches.
Okay, so on level 3, this is what we call the managed level. Here we're talking about planning control and the integration of crime prevention within the building control process, what in the UK is called building control, as in permission to build the development. And so we looked at the descriptors here, and clearly as it becomes more formal, there's more of a requirement to have these things laid down and agreed between the different parties. The main characteristics at this level are that the consideration of security is embedded into the planning control process, but this may need local legislation in terms of planning guidance, depending on how the planning is organised in that particular context. It may need local legislation. And the reason things need to be very formalised is that there's always the opportunity for a developer to challenge a decision legally. And so there needs to be some sort of legal foundation for an authority to say, we aren't going to allow this development because it contravenes some crime prevention guidance that's been given to the developer. So the legal process and the criteria for assessment are very much required.
So in terms of our example for level 3, then we've got Vienna City Council. And obviously Vienna is interesting because it's actually got low levels of crime. The police do deal with crime prevention, but that tends to be fairly narrowly defined. And it's only more recently that the police have been getting more involved in the planning process. What it means actually in Vienna is that issues related to security tend to be dealt with by other departments, so housing and welfare, health, etc. And of course, because it's dealt with by other departments, that means that it's not the primary issue. It has to be integrated with other objectives. And it often means that crime prevention is actually implicit rather than explicit. So what we've seen in Vienna is that it's been dealt with in relation to women's safety and security, and it's become part of their gender mainstreaming strategy. If you actually look at the documentation that's been produced, you can see that it very much borrows on SEPTEB principles, but those have been incorporated into gender mainstreaming discourse. And they have a department that deals with that, and that has been running for some time. And so what they have now is that new housing must meet women's requirements for feelings of safety. And they've got guidelines. But what distinguishes it in terms of actually being on level 3 is that they do actually have a mechanism for checking new developments. And that's come about because the government actually subsidises new developments that comply with gender mainstreaming principles. So applicants have to give design details for the proposed development, and then those design details are then checked by a committee. And the committee can actually request that alterations are made if it doesn't conform to the criteria. And as a result of that, then it means that the majority of residential dwellings do consider then feelings of security. And they're also starting to consider it also in terms of master planning. But it is a different situation in the sense that it's issues of insecurity that are addressed rather than crime. And also they don't actually have data on crime and insecurity that is made available to planners, developers and architects. In fact, the police are not very involved in the process at all, so it is a different situation to some other contexts.
Okay, so level 4, the final level, embedded, as I discussed earlier. The key characteristics of this are that crime prevention is viewed as part of good design and an aspect of professional good practice by planners, architects, by the professionals involved in the development, and that consequently there's the opportunity for crime prevention advice to become a consultation activity within that development process. There are lots of different consultants operating in urban development on all sorts of things. In the UK we have a consultant on bats, for example, will be involved in a project if it's required, on toads or, depending on the environment, on different sorts of activities. But you have this opportunity for the role of crime prevention to become professionalised as a consultation role, and also there then becomes the requirement for it to be much earlier in the process, because assessing the design at the very end, any changes will obviously incur quite a cost for a developer that may have taken some time to develop it. So if it does become a consulting role, it becomes something that is needed earlier on in the design process to fit in with that whole development process. So the example we have from Manchester of that we're currently at level 3, but attempting to move to level 4. And this isn't a UK example. This is, I mean, it is UK, but it's not the whole of the UK. This is very specific to Manchester. And a lot of the stuff we've been looking at is actually specific to very local environments and contexts. So this is Greater Manchester, the map of Greater Manchester. And Manchester City Council is that sort of long, thin local authority at the centre. There are 10 local authorities that make up the metropolitan area of Greater Manchester. And in terms of background, Manchester City, because Manchester City Council involves the very centre, the heart of the city, was incredibly run down in the 70s. And so there were, as you can see, there were less than 1,000 residents in the 80s. In the 2001 census, it was suddenly nearly 12,000. I don't know what the 2010 census says. We haven't seen the results of that yet. But there was an increase in development suddenly in a burst in the 1990s of residential flats being built in the city centre. We also had the IRA bomb that went off. There was a whole load of redevelopment around that. And a massive expansion of the late-night economy as the UK relaxed its licensing laws as well. And that led to a whole number of problems in the city centre to do with crime and antisocial behaviour. And as a result, for the City Council, crime became a very political issue. And they do citizen surveys every year, and security or lack of it was seen as a key issue for citizens. So they were engaged very heavily in the idea of they needed to get involved with crime prevention. Around the same time, at the UK level, we had the Crime and Disorder Act was brought in 1998, and that resulted in the establishment of local crime and disorder reduction partnerships. They're now called community safety partnerships, but groups of authorities, agencies that were involved in the city centre were charged with thinking about crime prevention. So it moved crime from being a problem that primarily the police dealt with to something that other partners were sort of enforced to get involved with. And it's still very much the police are the leading edge, but there are all sorts of agencies involved in this. On top of that, there were resources made available, and there was national initiatives to make sure that good practice would be disseminated. So all of this in Greater Manchester coincided with the operations in the police, where in all police forces in the UK, we have what's called architectural liaison officers. And they are officers who are trained in crime prevention, and they are asked to give advice to architects and developers within the planning process. And in Manchester, they had, rather than employ policemen, they actually employed ex-architects, ex-planners, people from the development industry, which gave a completely different flavour to the service that they were actually delivering in Manchester. They also had them full-time in the role, rather than in some forces they're part-time police officers doing normal police duties and part-time doing crime prevention work. In Manchester, they're full-time giving advice to the development industry. They conduct reviews of development projects that are submitted for planning approval, including non-residential development. So it's in Manchester City Council, it's most development types get reviewed by these ALOs. So what we were doing with them, we helped with the Solution Centre helped with the development of what they call the crime impact statement, which is where crime is considered in the planning process alongside all sorts of other impact statements that go in with the planning application. So they have environmental impact, they have to do with energy use now, they have all sorts of impact statements. So the police developed this crime impact statement, which was a report which gave an estimate of the impact of this development on crime in the area it was proposed. And we did some work with them to rebrand the crime prevention activity of the police from architectural liaison, which is quite military sounding term, to design for security consultants. So we rebranded them. They're now called Design for Security. If you go to designforsecurity.org, that's actually Greater Manchester Police. But they recognised that the people they were dealing with the police wasn't something they would normally do. So to actually position themselves as a consultancy to the process worked better. It also enabled them to get paid for that role. As they became a consultant, they could then charge these developers fees because they were effectively helping them smooth the way through the planning process. By having early stage intervention and being able to actually give advice before designs were finalised meant there was much less of a chance of what would normally happen. The police would object at the planning process, at the planning stage, and then the developer would have to go and make changes, and it would cost a lot of money. So by getting rid of these last-minute surprises, as they call them, they were seen as a cost benefit to the developer. And so there was quite a small charge made, but enough to help the police meet the need for this service, because as it developed, as the Manchester City Council decided they liked the idea, they wanted more and more of development types to have these reviews. So I'm just quickly going to nip through the process with you. This is the process that's used or was used prior to the crime impact statement, and it's actually something that's used in most forces in the country. So you have 3 columns here. The left-hand side is the architect and the developer, the middle is the planner, and on the right is the architectural liaison officer. And as you can see, the architectural liaison officer doesn't actually get involved until down here. So you have all this toing and froing between the architect developing stuff, the planner being involved, and then right at the end, the plans get sent to the police, and the police, in a lot of cases, would say, we don't like this, we object. And then they've only got 21 days to review the plans. The requirement in the UK is that you have a 21 period of having a planning decision. And so that can potentially cause all sorts of problems for the developer. The new approach that was developed in Manchester, the CIS, the Crime Impact Statement, right at the start here, when they first meet with the planners, the planners tell them that they need to talk to the police, and they start a dialogue of consultation here, which ends up in a report being given to the architect with the police's specifications. Again, this is not police officers, these are planners and architects employed by the police who will look at what the problems are in the particular area and actually look to try and tailor the advice to suit that particular context. And then that, when it comes back, the police still get to see it at the end, and hopefully they'll have had their advice incorporated. If not, they can still object, but it's down to the planning committee or the planning officer to make the decision whether to go with the police's objection or not. But this, moving into the process, earlier into the process, enables much better consultation to happen, and therefore approaches to crime prevention that aren't just bolt-on, adding fences and locks and bolts. It's much more embedded within the development, the crime prevention ideas. Okay, so that's the basic maturity model. What we were interested in is the gaps between them. What is it that enables people to move or to be at one level rather than at another level? What are the enablers in terms of the processes that are in place or the capabilities within that group of organisations that are doing that? And so this is as far as we got with the Plus project, was to actually develop the model. And so what we want to do is to actually look further into this, and ideally we'd like to look at identifying in more detail, looking at more case studies, exactly what it is to enable people to operate, enable groups to operate crime prevention in the ways that they do.
And just as our final slide is that obviously there are a number of issues that we do have at the moment. We were very glad to hear about the success of some of the efforts to design out crime through the design of vehicles and housing, etc. But the situation at the moment, obviously, is that we're in a financial crisis, and there's very much a focus on economic recovery. In the UK, what that actually means is that they're relaxing the controls over the planning process, because what they want to do is to stimulate a housing boom. What they're also doing is cutting the budgets in relation to the police, and because the police are often at the forefront of crime prevention, then that is a serious threat to some of the activities that they've been involved in. The other problem, of course, is that because of the reduction in crime, ironically, it means that there's less priority given to that area. And within other discourses, such as the security discourse at a European level, for instance, then there is talk about crime, but crime tends to be classified as a petty crime, and petty in English means trivial. And so the orientation we're worried about is that it's actually shifting towards more disaster, like earthquakes, flooding, terrorist attacks, events that happen more rarely, and that might take the focus away from common crimes that impact on quality of life.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a very interesting thought on how to embed crime prevention in a structural, way within the people that are involved in crime prevention. I think that's very good. We need to talk about this too. but we would have time for one question, if there's one question. No? Yes, there is.
I was wondering how you managed, or how the politics managed to get the measures through that everybody has to work together with the police in the planning process, because I would think that normally the developers have no interest in working together with police and everything, because it's just more costs for them and they can't perhaps do the building side the way they like. So how did the politics manage to get that through?
I mean, I should say that we don't specify that they must work with the police, because actually we saw in Vienna that they're not working together with the police. What we're trying to show is that there's different approaches. Within the UK, then the architects will work with the police because the architects have geared, the police have geared a service towards them, and because they actually get benefits from consulting with the police, because then it helps them to go through the planning process. But that has come about very much because of the relationship between the planning authorities and also the police, that they've been able to integrate the two together.
In terms of, in the Manchester example, that has taken 10 years to develop, and it started off very small, and it started off with only developments of more than 50 dwellings. So originally it was quite big projects, and there was more justification for it. What's happened is that the architects, often it's the same architects, the same developers building, as you know, it's very localised building industries, and they're quite happy with, in Manchester, how things are being delivered. So it fits, it does, they recognise that it saves them time to have things dealt with at the earlier stage. In other forces which aren't able to operate at that level because they just don't have the resource, it is often voiced that it's a different approach in different forces, and because they're not able to operate at that level, there is more of a friction between developers and police, because often the police are saying no to something and it's not explained why they're saying no. I think it is very context dependent, as we explained at the start, and Manchester is quite an interesting example, and the way it came about is for a lot of very context-driven, you know, even down to individuals being in certain posts and getting on with other individuals and enabling things to happen. So it isn't by design that this has happened, it's sort of by luck, and then it's being pushed by key individuals.
Okay, thanks again for your speech.